She's running barefoot through the dark. It's sometime after midnight, and the air outside is so cold it feels like inhaling broken glass. Her wrists are bleeding. The handcuffs are still on. One side locked to her wrist, the other dangling loose and scraping against her skin with every desperate stride she takes. She doesn't know exactly where she is. She just knows she has to get to the highway. She has to get to the highway before he realizes she's gone. Behind her, somewhere back in the dark, is a small house, and inside that house is a man that the entire city of Anchorage, Alaska thinks they know. A family man, a churchgoer, a hunter, a baker. And she is the only person in the world who knows what he really is. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. Now I need to ask you a quick favor. If you do not subscribe to this channel in the next 30 seconds, a very small and determined raccoon will somehow obtain your home address, show up at 3 a.m., and rearrange every single item in your refrigerator into alphabetical order. We're talking pickles next to pineapple, mayo next to mangoes. It's going to be deeply unsettling. Please subscribe to Black Noir Files and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. To understand how a man could become what Robert Hansen became, you have to go back to the beginning. Not to Alaska, not to the wilderness. You have to go back to a small town in Iowa in the 1940s, where a skinny, deeply awkward kid named Robert Christian Hansen was growing up in a world that seemed almost designed to make him feel invisible. He was born on February 15, 1939 in Esterville, Iowa. His father, Christian Hansen, ran a local bakery, a hard-working Danish immigrant who had high standards, a strict temperament, and by most accounts, very little patience for a son who couldn't seem to do anything right. Robert was not athletic. He was not popular. He had a significant stutter that made every conversation feel like a public humiliation. And on top of all of that, he had severe acne throughout his adolescence, the kind that left real scars, both on his skin and somewhere deeper that never really healed. The girls in his school didn't notice him, or when they did, it was for the wrong reasons. He asked a girl to a dance once, and she laughed. Not a polite, gentle kind of rejection. She laughed. And here's the thing about moments like that when you're a teenager. You either learn to let them go, or you don't. Robert Hansen didn't let it go. He worked in his father's bakery. He learned to knead dough before the sun came up. He learned to frost cakes and portion bread and smile at customers and say, "Have a good day," with a warmth that cost him something every single time. And all the while, underneath that flour-dusted apron, something was quietly calcifying inside of him. He joined the Army Reserve in 1957, briefly. He got married in 1960, a marriage that would fall apart fast. He was arrested for burning down a school bus garage in Pocahontas, Iowa in 1960. He spent 20 months in prison. When he got out, he married again, a woman named Darla, who would become the mother of his children, and who by every account from neighbors and church friends seemed to genuinely believe she was married to a good man. That's important. Remember that. He moved to Anchorage, Alaska in 1967, and that's when his two worlds really began to solidify. On one side, Robert Hansen, beloved community baker, a man who ran Hansen's Bakery on Old Seward Highway, who made cinnamon rolls that people drove across town for, who coached youth activities, who sat in a church pew every Sunday. A man who seemed, by every visible measure, like the kind of person a town is built on. And on the other side, Robert Hansen, trophy hunter. This part wasn't a secret. In fact, it was almost celebrated. He was a genuinely skilled big game hunter who had taken down Dall sheep, grizzly bears, and caribou across some of the most unforgiving terrain in North America. He owned a small Piper Super Cub plane. He flew it himself into remote wilderness areas that most people couldn't access even with a full expedition crew. He set world records. He had the trophies mounted on his walls. Nobody thought much about the combination: a baker who hunted, a family man with a plane, a churchgoer who spent weekends in the wild. If anything, it made him seem more interesting, more Alaskan, more real. But there was a third world that nobody could see, and it had been building for a very long time. By the early 1970s, Anchorage was a city in the middle of a boom. The Trans-Alaska Pipeline was under construction. Workers were flooding in from all over the country. The city had a raw, frontier energy, money and danger in equal amounts. And in that environment, a subculture of strip clubs, escort services, and street-level sex work had grown up almost overnight to service the incoming population. The women who worked in those spaces were often young, often far from home, often struggling in ways that made them vulnerable to people who wanted to use that vulnerability. They were women who, if they disappeared, investigators might be slow to notice. Women who lived at the margins of a city that was moving too fast to look back at who it was leaving behind. Robert Hansen noticed them. Investigators believe that his first abduction occurred around 1971, though the full timeline wouldn't be understood for more than a decade. What's known is that over the course of roughly 12 years, Hansen abducted at least 17 women, most of them dancers or sex workers he approached in Anchorage. The details of how he lured them vary, but a pattern emerges from the women who survived and from what Hansen himself eventually admitted. He would approach them, he would offer money, he would drive them somewhere isolated, and then, for some of them, the situation would change very fast. For most of his victims, he flew them out in his plane. That's the part that is almost impossible to fully absorb. He had a private aircraft. He had a detailed knowledge of the Alaskan wilderness. He knew places where a person could be taken and never found unless someone already knew where to look. He would land in a remote area, somewhere in the Nick River region, somewhere in the vast, silent wilderness outside Anchorage. Snow-covered mountains in every direction, trees that went on for hundreds of miles, and he would release them. He would let them run. And then he would hunt them with a rifle, with a Ruger Mini 14. The same hands that shaped bread dough every morning would take aim in the frozen silence of the Alaskan backcountry. And most of the time, those women never made it back. He kept a map, an aviation sectional chart, the kind of detailed aerial map that pilots use to navigate. And on it, in small, coded marks, he had recorded the locations of his burial sites. 24 marks on that map, some in pencil, some in ink. Each one a place in the wilderness where he had left something behind. For years, the map stayed hidden, the women stayed missing, and Robert Hansen stayed in his bakery, making cinnamon rolls, going to church, and flying his plane on weekends. That might have been the end of the story, except for one woman who refused to let it be. It's the early morning hours of June 13, 1983. Anchorage is cold, even in summer. The sky at this hour has that pale gray-blue quality that Alaska gets during the brief window between the long summer evenings and the next morning's light. A trucker is rolling down the Glen Highway when he sees something in the road ahead. Something moving. He slows down and realizes it's a person, a young woman running along the highway shoulder in a state of obvious terror. She's 17 years old. Her name is Cindy Paulson. She is wearing almost nothing in weather that would make most people shiver fully clothed, and her left wrist has a handcuff locked to it. The trucker stops. Cindy gets in, and through tears and shaking in a voice that keeps breaking, she tells him what happened. She had been approached earlier that night by a man who offered her money. He had taken her back to a house on Old Harbor Road. Inside, he had chained her to a post in the basement. He had assaulted her, and when she had found a brief window, a moment when his attention was elsewhere, she had wrenched the cuff loose from whatever it was anchored to, and she had run, barefoot, into the Alaskan night. She had run, and she had not looked back, and she had made it to the highway. She gives police a description of her attacker. She describes the house. She describes a Gold Piper Super Cub plane she saw parts near a nearby airstrip. Police respond. They identify the address. They knock on the door of a modest house on Old Harbor Road. Robert Hansen answers. He is 44 years old, medium build with a slight, wiry frame that doesn't look like much. He has thin hair and pale, scarred skin, the remnants of those teenage years he never quite escaped. He is calm when he opens the door, almost unnervingly calm. He listens to what police have to say. He doesn't panic, he doesn't reach for anything. He just looks at them with mild, measured eyes and begins to speak. He tells them they have the wrong man. He tells them he doesn't know what they're talking about. He's a family man, he's a baker, he's a respected member of this community. And then he makes a phone call. The call is to a man named John Caton. John Caton was a prominent Anchorage businessman, well-connected, well-regarded. And he told police, without apparent hesitation, that Robert Hansen had been with him that night. An alibi. Clean, simple, and from a credible source. Police released Robert Hansen. Think about that for a second. Cindy Paulson, a 17-year-old girl who had just escaped with a handcuff still on her wrist, told police exactly what had happened and exactly who did it. And because a businessman made a phone call, the man who did it walked out of that conversation a free man. She wasn't believed. Not fully, not fast enough. But there was one investigator who couldn't let it go. Glenn Floth was a sergeant with the Alaska State Troopers. He had been tracking a series of missing women cases for some time, a pattern that had been building quietly in the background of the city's consciousness for years. Women who had gone missing from Anchorage, women from the strip clubs and the service industry, women who, one by one, had simply stopped being seen. Floth looked at Cindy Paulson's account and saw something that went beyond a single assault. He brought in the FBI, and this is where the story takes a turn that should make anyone who values the justice system deeply uncomfortable. The FBI, at least initially, was skeptical. The idea that a respected local businessman, a baker, a family man, a hunter with trophies on the wall, could also be a serial predator who flew women into the wilderness and hunted them down? It sounded like something from a bad crime novel. It sounded impossible, too cinematic, too extreme. And so for months, while Floth pushed and argued and presented his case, the full force of a federal investigation was slow to follow. Floth didn't stop. He went back to the cases of missing women. He started mapping locations. He cross-referenced Hansen's known flight paths with the areas where bodies had been found, or where women had last been seen before disappearing into thin air. The pattern kept pointing back to the same person. In October of 1983, investigators obtained a search warrant for Robert Hansen's home. This time, they looked harder. In the attic, they found a Ruger Mini 14 rifle. They found jewelry belonging to victims. They found newspaper clippings about the murders. And they found the aviation map, this sectional chart with 24 hand-marked locations in the Alaskan wilderness. Based on the evidence recovered in that search, court documents, and Hansen's own eventual confession, this is what investigators came to understand about what had happened over those 12 years. Robert Hansen had lived his entire adult life in two parallel realities. In one reality, he was a man who had built something out of nothing, a business, a family, a reputation. He had overcome the stuttering kid from Iowa, the prison sentence, the failed first marriage. He had made himself into someone Anchorage respected. And on some level, that mattered to him. He needed that. He needed to be seen a certain way. But the other reality, the one that had been building since that girl laughed at him at a dance, since every moment of humiliation and invisibility that he had carried forward from a childhood that never fully let him go, that reality had never gone away. It had just gone underground. The women he targeted weren't random to him. They were women he felt were beneath him socially, women whose disappearances he calculated would go unnoticed or be poorly investigated. He was right about that for a long time. The wilderness was his advantage and his comfort. He knew it better than almost anyone in the state. His plane gave him access to places where no ground search could easily follow. And the hunting, investigators came to believe, was the point. It wasn't just violence, it was something he had ritualized, a performance of a kind of power he had spent his whole life feeling he'd been denied. He was the predator now. He was the one in control. When detectives confronted Hansen with the aviation map, when they put it in front of him and told him that they knew, that the evidence was there, that it was over, he eventually broke. In a January 1984 confession, Robert Hansen admitted to the murders of 17 women. He agreed to lead investigators to the burial sites marked on that map. Body after body recovered from the Alaskan wilderness, from the Nick River Valley, from remote stretches of land that look from above like they could swallow a person without a trace. Because they had. On February 27, 1984, Robert Christian Hansen was sentenced to 461 years plus life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was sent to Spring Creek Correctional Center in Seward, Alaska. He never walked free again. He died in prison on August 21, 2014, at the age of 75. Now here's the thing I want you to sit with for a moment. The thing that, once you hear it, kind of reframes everything. Robert Hansen was never fully stopped by an investigation that built a case from scratch. He was never brought down by forensic science or surveillance or an informant who came forward. He was stopped because one teenage girl with almost nothing, no shoes, no coat, one handcuff still locked to her wrist, refused to stop running. She made it to a highway. She got into a truck. She told her story. And even when authorities initially chose to believe a businessman over her, she kept telling it. The aviation map had 24 marked locations. Hansen confessed to 17 murders. The difference between those two numbers, 7, represents women whose remains were never definitively identified and matched. 7 marks on that map with no confirmed name attached to them. 7 women who to this day are still out there in the Alaskan wilderness. Robert Hansen hid their locations in a code only he understood, and he took that part of the code with him when he died. One woman's courage broke this case open, and the map that was supposed to help bring answers still holds some of its secrets to this day. That's the Robert Hansen story. And honestly, I don't know about you, but I find it hard to move on from that too quickly. The baker who built a life of community and faith and family while carrying something in him that had no name until bodies started coming up out of the frozen ground. Alaska has a way of hiding things. For 12 years, it hid his. If this story hit you the way it hit me the first time I went deep on it, there are more cases like this in the archive here on Black Noir Files. Stories that live in that same dark space where ordinary life and unthinkable acts share the same address. Every upload we do is designed to leave you thinking for a long time after the video ends. So if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment below. I genuinely want to know what part of this story stayed with you. And I'll see you in the next one.